Hello all. For my research project, I did the impact of vegan and also some of the studies reference vegetarian diets and how those influence the composition of the gut microbiota. All right, introduction. So first, looking at vegan and vegetarian diets. Vegetarians are those who avoid meat, directly consuming animals, and vegans avoid meat, but also eggs and dairy, and sometimes honey, potentially. And the research behind this, both of these diets are growing in popularity. They represent vegetarians are 5% of the population, and vegans are roughly 2% of the population. And there's good scientific research backing up the reasons for switching to these diets. Vegetarian diets seem to be protective against a lot of diseases, cardiovascular diseases, certain metabolic diseases, and certain cancers, and in general, all-cause mortality. And vegans might obtain a few additional benefits, such as prevention of high blood pressure, protection from obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular mortality. And also, so looking at the human gut microbiota, first of all, an important distinction is that there's the microbiota, which is the actual microorganisms that make up that live in and on humans, and then there's the microbiome, which is actually the summation of the genes of all these microbiota. So sometimes they're used interchangeably, but there is a distinction there. And it's become a lot more, the microbiota has gotten a lot more medical research and attention lately as we learn more about it. And more evidence is coming out the vast impact that the microbiota can have on human health and disease. Each human harbors nearly 1 trillion microbes. And these aren't just bacteria, these can be viruses, fungi, archaea, but specifically we will be looking at the bacterial microbiota of the human intestinal tract. And also interesting to note is that humans are nearly 99.9% genetically identical to each other, in terms of their genome. But when you look at each individual's microbiota genome, their microbiome, this can be almost 90% different. So that really points to the vast difference in the makeup of individuals in terms of the microbiota. And specifically, why it's gaining a lot of attention is it's believed that the microbiota through diet, or it might be through diet, that a lot of the beneficial impacts occur. And these can include anything from immunity to the gastrointestinal tract, obviously, like Crohn's and IBD, and immunity, the brain, the cardiovascular system. All of these have been shown to be impacted by microbiota. So basically there's three main bacterial types which make up most of the bacteria in the gut. The first one is Prevotella, which is generally considered a positive microorganism and is anti-inflammatory. There's bacteroids, which are generally considered not a good organism to have an overabundance of, and they're linked to certain pathologies. And there's Ramunicoccus, which is not, there's not too much research on right now. And it's hard to say one of these is like good or bad. Like a healthy gut has all of these, but you don't want, generally it's not good if there's a super low amount of Prevotella or super high amount of bacteroids. And basically, when the gut becomes imbalanced, it's believed that it could be linked to all these pathologies, such as reflux, ulcers, IBS, steatohepatitis, irritable bowel disease, atherosclerosis, cancer, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS. So it even goes to the brain. So it goes on. The list goes on and on of what could possibly be implicated. And it's believed that the gut microbiota might be one of the main mechanisms for the positive or negative influence of diet rather than the direct impact of food on the human body, which there is, but the gut microbiota and how diet affects that might be one of the main mechanisms that um, how diet is good or bad for you. And basically, different diets and foods have different impacts on the host microbiota and the postbiotics, what the host microbiota make. Um, yep. So just to clarify a few things for terms, diversity kind of means the number or the richness or which species are present. And abundance means the evenness or how many species are present of distinct types of organisms. And looking at the scientific classification here for a little clarity, there's phylum, class, order, but basically phylum is an example is bacteroids, which I'll bring up a lot. But then it goes all the way down to the species, which I'll also mention. And some of these studies will mention any of these. Sometimes they're trying to give a broad overview, and sometimes a much more specific overview. And bifidobacterium is an example I used here at the bottom. All right, so just looking at my methods, this was a comprehensive review of the literature to see how vegan diets impact the gut microbiota makeup. Peer-reviewed research was used. I used Google Scholar, PubMed, and a few other sources. And I generally try to study the research in the last 15 years. Typically 10 years is better, but I want to kind of increase the window of research that I could use. And it was kind of even split between review articles and primary research that was used. And the objectives here address the question, how does a vegan diet impact the gut microbiota? And kind of the purpose of this review is to look at the research and kind of evaluate if a vegan diet is, or at least to open the gates to evaluate whether a vegan diet is an appropriate means of positively benefiting human health. And hopefully this, like I said, this will pave the way for future research to determine situations in which there's potentially an imbalance of gut microbiota or a disease state that's associated with it, and potentially, say, like diabetes. There's other reasons to pursue a vegan or vegetarian diet, but also looking at that, the microbiota imbalance, knowing that vegan diet can potentially balance that, could be used as kind of a reason for using it as a treatment option in that scenario. So looking at the research, my findings. Okay, looking at the first study by Prochaskova et al., what I thought was interesting about this study is that, well, first they were looking at vegan diet is associated with the effects on the metabolic performance of the intestinal microbiota. And so what was unique about this study is that they were looking at both the serum of the individuals and the feces of the individuals. And this allowed them to look at both the microbiota impact of the diets and secondarily also the metabolites within the feces, but also how those metabolites enter into the serum of humans. And so basically 62 vegans, 33 omnivores were analyzed. And what was interesting about this study is that they didn't seem to find that there was a significant impact on the gut diversity in the vegan diet. And in fact, the omnivores had a higher diversity level. And most of the studies I've looked at don't show this. But also, it seemed that the long-term vegan diets, these vegans were on the diet for roughly 3 years. It only affected roughly 15% of the bacteria or 15% of the gut microbiome. But what is interesting is that roughly 43% of the metabolites were significantly different between omnivores and vegans in the feces. And it seemed that fiber was one of the big correlators in diet here and the impact. And this increases species such as Ramunicoccus, fecal bacterium persnitzii, and Also, what was interesting is that different macronutrients correlate with some of the other bacteria. Like protein seems to correlate with Streptococcus, fat correlates with Peptococca. Um, yeah, so this is interesting. And another study I looked at looks at this, the fat. It seems to inversely, or alternately, sorry, not inversely, alternately affect. It seems to increase bacteroids and decrease certain other bacteria. And this study did show that bacteroids, Prevotella, and Bifidobacterium were higher in vegans. And it's also interesting because a lot of studies show that Bifidobacterium is not higher in vegans. But what is of importance is the metabolomes, the metabolites. There was a significant difference between the diet types. Okay, and as you can see here, the vegan serum had significantly different levels of metabolites. 56% of all the ones that were measured were significantly different. So that's pretty significant. Um, but looking at the specific bacteria, it seemed to be that for the abundance levels, it was 46% versus 52% abundance for the phyloformicosites, 44 and 41% for bacteroids, 1.6 for both for proteobacteria, 1.8 and 4.2% for actinobacteria, and 0.2 and 0.4 for Microbiota in the vegans and omnivores, respectively. And looking at some of these metabolites, a lot of them were these amino acid fermentation products, such as P-cresol, skatol, indole, and these were all significantly higher in the omnivore group. But there were certain sulfur compounds like methionol that were higher in the vegan group. And also worth mentioning is that short chain fatty acids were higher in the vegan group, and vegans also had a lower level of branched chain amino acids. And so looking at all these different products, P-cresol is not a good thing. It's a product of protein fermentation. It's associated with genotoxicity, oxidative stress, leaky gut, poor epithelial cell viability, and increased proliferation. And also the branched chain amino acids are associated with poor metabolic health and potentially diabetes development. But the short chain fatty acids, thankfully, and significantly impacted by a vegan diet, are good. These are byproducts of bacterial fermentation in the gut, in the colon. One of the most famous of these is probably butyrate, and this has been shown to have a lot of beneficial impacts on the epithelial cells of the colon. The epithelial cells can directly use butyrate as an energy source. It seems to help decrease risks of colon cancer and numerous other benefits, and we'll continue to look at these in the next slides. So the next study we'll look at by these names, Matijac et al. Looked at the associations between dietary types and the microbiota, looking at vegetarians and omnivores. And these individuals were from Slovenia. And as you can see here, the vegan diet was associated with a higher level or a higher ratio of bacteroids to Prevotella. And and Clostridium coccoides group was lower in the vegetarians. And specific types of bacteroids were also higher in the vegetarians. Bacteroids, the Adiomicron, and then also Clostridium species, Clostridium clostridiform, was also higher in the vegetarians. And important well-known bacteria, Faecalbacterium prausnitzii, was also significantly higher in the vegan group. And from this same study here, you can see the impact of the different diet types, looking at the bacterial, the DGGE bands, where they look at the RNA is identified through the polymerase chain reaction, I believe they use. And here the significant differences are bold. So here in the first group, you can see that the omnivores have certain higher levels of bacteria, such as, these names, the certain levels, and then also the vegetarians have significantly higher levels of certain bacteria, like here, the first one for the fecal bacterium, the Prisnitzi. And what was also interesting is the bifidobacterium seems to not necessarily always correlate with the vegan or vegetarian diet. And that could be probably through lots of reasons. It could have been based on how you were born. They've shown C-sections versus natural births significantly affect bifidobacterium. Early diet, like breastfed versus formula fed. And so there could be a lot of other factors here that are more important than adult vegetarian or omnivore diet in terms of bifidobacterium. And so looking at the review by Zhao et al., which was, yes, a review, they generally found that vegetarian microbiomes were more diverse through the multiple studies that they evaluated. And this is mediated through different dietary components like macronutrients, like obviously fat, protein, carbohydrates, because not only does the fiber impact this, but also fat and protein, which is not always thought of when you're thinking about microbiota fermentation, but they like to use certain fats and proteins as well based on species. And also phytochemicals, like different polyphenols, phytoesterols, flavonoids, have been shown to have a significant impact on the microbiota composition. And also that these metabolites, again, are highlighted as a significant contribution from the microbiota. So some of the bacteria that seem to like fiber, Rosbergia, Enterococca rectal, and then it seems that when fat intake goes down, bacteroids goes down as well, and bifidobacterium goes up, and as well as certain bacteria actually seem to like plant protein more, I guess based on the specific amino acids. One of these is arginine, which the bacteria can use to produce putrescine and spermidine, and this is associated and shown to help with normal cell growth in the intestinal tract. And it also seems that the different flavonoids, specifically lactobacillus, likes to consume flavonoids. And revisiting some of the short-chain fatty acids, like I mentioned, butyrate, it seems to help mediate immune regulation through HDACs and GPRs, these receptors in the intestinal cells, and prevents an overreaction of the immune system. Helps in the function of T regulatory cells, helps reduce tumor necrosis factor alpha, NF-kappa B, interleukin 6, interleukin 12, and it also seems to promote a healthy production of secretory IgA, which is the main immunoglobulin secreted by the mucosal lining in our body, whether that be intestinal tract or nasal passages. And this helps both protect the inside of the body from bacteria in the gut, but also allows for a healthy recognition and prevent an overactive immune response. Basically just helping mediate that immune reaction to all these bacteria that are present inside the intestinal tract. Okay, and so looking at another study by Zimmer et al., the fecal samples of 144 vegetarians and 105 vegans, along with 2 control groups, were used. One of the control groups was 35,000 stool samples, and the second control group was 400 healthy subjects. And both of these were looking at the feces of these individuals. And so the total bacterial counts of the feces remained the same for all groups. But among the 14 species or genera that were tested, vegetarians had significantly lower bacteroids and bifidobacterium. And the vegans also had significantly lower bacteroids, bifidobacterium, E. coli, and enterobacteria. And I think enterobacti and E. coli, I'm sure everyone's heard of E. coli. There's pathogenic and non-pathogenic strains, but it seems to be that these bacteria's growth was potentially more correlated to a decrease in stool pH, and then that these bacteria then cannot use, or they don't thrive in that lower pH that the vegan diets create. That biosystem that they create within the gut. And also these two bacteria also prefer proteins rather than carbohydrates, so that decrease in proteins and increase in carbohydrates, usually fiber, correlated with the vegan and vegetarian diets, don't favor these two bacterial species. And you can see here from these charts the CFU measures colony forming units from the bacteroids, bifidobacterium, E. coli, and enterobacteria amongst the vegan, vegetarian, and control groups. And also here, they also measured like I said, the stool pH, and you can see the significant difference in the stool pH. And also for the Zimmer et al. Study, here you can see the significance levels of the different bacterial strains. Basically, they're all significantly different in the vegans compared to control group 1. One of them was significant, just bifidobacterium was significantly different in vegans versus control group 2, and 2 of the bacteroids and the bifidobacterium were significant vegetarians versus control group 1, and none were significant versus control group 2. And the final study by Tomova et al. Was another review, and basically they found that it seems the vegan vegetarian diets do promote a more diverse and stable microbiome, higher levels of bacteroids, and specifically fibers seem to be linked with the different lactic acid bacteria like Ramunicoccus, Enterococcium rectal, and Roseberia. And these seem to be linked with a decrease in Clostridium and Enterococcus species. Also, the link between polyphenols and bifidobacterium and lactobacillus appears strong, and these are linked with anti-pathogenic and anti-inflammatory responses. Also, specifically fiber causes the increased production of short-chain fatty acids through feeding those specific bacteria that produce them, and these result in improved barrier function, immunity, and can be used as energy substrates. And also isothiocyanates are associated with vegan diets. It's a type of sulfur antioxidant, and it also seems that less TMAOs are associated with vegetarian diets, or more associated with omnivore diets. And this is a common compound from meat consumption and fermentation, and is linked with cardiovascular disease. So, in conclusion, it seems that vegan and vegetarian diets do increase microbial diversity, which is a good thing. The research on bacteroids is rather vague at this moment, and certain research shows confounding results. Vegan and vegetarian diets do lead to an increase in fiber-consuming bacteria, and this leads to a decrease in stool pH, which is a good thing, and an increase in short-chain fatty acids, which is also a good thing. The decrease in stool pH decreases the ability of certain bacteria to grow, like E. coli, and the short-chain fatty acids have all these secondary benefits in immune health and energy. And also, vegetarian and vegan diets show an alteration in certain gut metabolites, like less TMA, p-cresol, lower branched-chain amino acids, and more sulfur compounds and less aromatic compounds.